lives. They'd be better off if they were poor and unknown rather than wealthy and known, because it goes to their head and it becomes a destructive force. It's dangerous to prosper. It may be a blessing and you may enjoy the benefits, but it is a dangerous time in the life of a person. And so we learn these things about Job, and God made this statement about Job. He asked the question, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. You know, Job did well in his prosperity, but things are about to change. As soon as God made this statement, please listen to me, this is not what Job says about himself. That would be his profession. This is not what Job's friends or enemies said about him. That would be his reputation. This is what God said about Job, and what God says about you is the true measure of your character. He is never deceived. He never sees it distorted. He has a clear view of everything in light of eternity. Now, why do you emphasize that? Well, what you say about yourself is not wrong for me to profess to love God. The Bible says, Psalm 107, verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he hath redeemed from the hand of the enemy. It's not wrong for me to profess to be a Christian, nor is it wrong for me to profess to love God. But I will say this. I think quite frequently we overestimate our own spirituality. I mean, we're not being hypocritical. We're not lying. We're saying what we really think is true. You want an illustration of that? Jesus told the disciples, all of you will forsake me this night and flee. Peter said, though all men forsake thee, yet will I never forsake thee. I be willing to die with thee. He meant that with all of his heart. He really believed that he'd be willing to die with Jesus. I don't think he was being hypocritical. I think he really believed what he said. But just hours later, we find him warming his hands with the enemies of the Son of God, and ultimately cursing, swearing, and denying the Lord Jesus. When Peter denied the Lord, nobody was more surprised than Peter. He did not think he was capable of such a thing. So our profession, it's not wrong for me to profess to love God. But maybe what I need instead of profession and reputation, do you ever notice about your reputation? What other people think of you, it's always tainted by their love for you or their hate for you. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever noticed that your friends are way too kind? They turn a blind eye to all of your faults and sing your praises. And your enemies are way too harsh. They won't give you credit where credit's due. They'll criticize even the good things you do. So reputation is also tainted by people's love or hate for me. So my profession, I may be inaccurate about how devoted I am to God. I may be sincere in what I'm saying, but maybe I'm just not quite as committed as I think I am. And if you won't live for him day in, day out, won't be in church every time doors are open, you're not going to die for him. Don't kid yourself. If you won't live for him, you certainly wouldn't die for him. If other things take preeminence to living for him, living will take preeminence to dying for him. So our priorities, it's a priority check. But your reputation, even with reputation where somebody has a good one, you can build a reputation that's not really accurate. People sometimes labor to produce a certain reputation about themselves. Some of you know my testimony. I'm a converted barroom bouncer. Now, I'm not proud of that. That is where I came from. So I never did when I was a bouncer worry about the guy that came in mouth first. Hey, he's going to whip everybody. He ain't going to whip anybody. He's trying to intimidate everybody so he doesn't have to fight. Now, the only problem with doing that, some quiet guy over in the corner is going to get up and say, I want to see some of that outside. and it could be life's most embarrassing moment. So rather than trying to project an image that's not accurate, trying to intimidate, you think the devil's going to let you get away with pretending to be a better Christian than you are, and he's not going to expose you? You think the accuser doesn't know? You think he's not going to expose you? He's going to call you out. So you better be careful about promoting yourself as this great, wonderful Christian. Okay to profess to believe in Christ, okay to profess to love him, but I better do some of that with reserve and not labor too hard. You say, well, what about you saying reputation's not important? Oh, no. But I'll tell you what's better than reputation. Testimony. Exodus 25 and verse 16 tells us God told Moses to put the testimony in the ark. Not Noah's ark, the ark of the covenant that was in the tabernacle and later the temple. What was in the ark? Well, Aaron's rod that budded was in the ark. That was the visible, physical evidence that God had chosen the tribe of Aaron for the priesthood. He set them apart in that manner. It was stored as evidence in the ark. What else in there? Well, there was the pot of manna. That was the visible, physical evidence that God had supplied for his people in their wanderings. And then there was the 2 tables of stone. That was the visible, physical evidence that God had given Moses the 10 Commandments, the law of God. These things were called testimony. Testimony is physical evidence. If you go to a courtroom, they don't want to know your opinion. If they want testimony, they're looking for solid evidence, what you know to be true, what you can testify to. And God said that the testimony was in the ark. Testimony is visible evidence. Maybe I need a testimony. It's not what I say about myself, but it's how I live that bears witness to the substance of my Christianity. I should live in such a way so that it's undeniable. They don't have to believe what I say, but the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is undeniable. The evidence bears witness to the fact that I am a born-again Christian living for God. And, folks, I'm always harping at the home church to people about being in attendance. Your neighbors watch when you leave and when you come. They know your habits. They know if you go to church, don't go to church. And sometimes we're interested in reaching them on a big day, but that's about the only time we come. They're probably not going to come, and they don't think much of our Christianity. If you knew how critical people are of Christianity, you'd be a little more careful about how you conduct your affairs. You'd be a little more careful about your testimony, the evidence, what they see day in, day out, as they observe you, knowing you claim to be a Christian. And I'm not arguing whether or not you're saved. I'm just saying that people are watching, and what you say about yourself doesn't mean a whole lot to them if what you're doing doesn't prove it. They want that show and tell Christianity. Don't just tell me, go ahead and show me. I don't care about you telling me, not against that, but I want to see something far beyond just hearing about how much you love God and how important it is to do the will of God. So he tells us that this is not what Job said about himself, his profession. This is not what Job's friends or enemies said about him, his reputation. This is what God said about Job. It is the true measure of his character. Now we're going to come back, and hopefully I'll have time to cover some of the things that God said, but I want to point out just a few things. If you remember in chapter 1 and verse 8, Satan made an accusation against Job after God said, "Hast thou considered my servant Job?" You understand, at this point in time, Job had it all. He had everything that a man could have, materially, financially. He had it all. And God said, "Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth. God said that about Job when he had it all. He was clean, he was pure, he was right with God. And the Bible tells us God could make that statement. Satan's response was, doth Job serve God for naught? What he was saying, he said, you have this hedge around him. I can't touch him. He said, anybody'd serve you for the way Job prospers. He's the richest man, the most famous man. Who wouldn't serve you for those kind of fringe benefits? He said, you take that stuff away from Job, and he'll curse you like any other man. And the Bible tells us that God lowered the hedge and gave Satan permission to touch Job. Now, there are a couple of things here that are encouraging to me. First of all, it's encouraging to me to know that as a believer, it's possible for me to live in such a way so that Satan can only touch me by permission. The second thing that encourages me is the fact that God told Satan how far he could go and where he had to stop. God, who knows my limitations, he said, you can touch everything but his life. By the way, Satan touched everything but his life. In a matter of hours, Job had one servant after another coming to him. His servants were dead, his flocks, his herds. All of his wealth was taken. His wealth wasn't so much in gold and silver as it was in assets and animals, and it was all taken away by the Sabaeans and others who attacked. And Job seemed to be almost unmoved by the loss of his material possessions. But then at the end of the chapter, Job gets word, a servant comes and tells him, your 10 children were feasting in a house, and a tornadic wind hit the house. It collapsed, and your 10 children are gone. Now you stop and think about that for a moment. A 10-casket funeral thrust upon you in a matter of hours. You went from prosperity to poverty, and now you're bereaved of all 10 of your children in 1 hour. The Bible tells us Job was broken over what happened. It says in verse 20, when he got the word in verse 19, verse 20 said, then Job arose and rent his mantle, tore his clothing, shaved his head, fell down upon the ground. And everything it says to that point was symbolic in the Eastern culture of grief and mourning, of bereavement. Rent his mantle, shaved his head, fell down upon the ground, and then there's a word that looks out of place. It says he worshiped. He worshiped with a broken heart. He worshiped while being in grief over the loss of his 10 children. He worshiped. You understand, God doesn't have to earn my worship, and it's not because of my circumstances I worship him because of who he is, not because of what my circumstances are. The Bible tells us that Job worshiped God, and in verse 21, he made a statement, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He said, everything I've lost, God gave me to start with. I'm not going to get bitter against God. I'm grieved that I lost it. I'm grieved that it's gone. But I'm not going to get bitter against God because he was good enough to let me have it for a time. Now, when you come to chapter 2, verse 9, and by the way, all this happened before God asked Satan a second time. He said, how about now, Satan? Job worshiped with a broken heart. How about now? Hast thou considered my servant Job, verse 3, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity. Although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. And Satan said, skin for skin. You let me touch everything but his life. You let me touch his body. You let me touch his skin. And he'll curse you like any other man. And by the way, God lowered the hedge a little more. Let Satan touch him. And now Job is out there sitting on an ash heap, scraping, oozing sores with broken pottery, in awful pain. And his wife is at her wit's end. She's bereaved of her 10 children. She's entered into the jaws of death 10 times to bring them into the world. Now her husband is in a pathetic state, almost dysfunctional. And she says to Job in chapter 2 and verse 9, she said, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. So what was she saying? She was saying, why don't we keep serving a God that lets all this bad stuff happen to us? What have we done? Huh? God was so good, everything in our life be good. Why do we keep serving him? By the way, this is not a bad woman. This is a good woman at her wit's end. What she desperately needs right now is a man of God at the house. We need one in the pulpit, but every house needs a man of God at the house. Somebody to speak the voice of reason when emotions are out of control. You can't even imagine the grief this woman's experiencing. Bereaved of her 10 children in 1 hour. Now her husband's ill. He can't do anything but scrape oozing sores on an ash heap. And he said, you speak as one of the foolish women. Don't talk like that. And he asked her a question. He said, shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord, and shall we not receive evil? He was asking her a few things. Number one, he was reminding her that we live in a sin-cursed world. And in a sin-cursed world, sometimes bad things happen to good people with no logical explanation as to why. You could never figure it out. But he was asking her, did you really think all the bad stuff was going to happen to somebody else and we were going to get out of here unscathed? Really? Is that a realistic thought? All the bad stuff's going to happen to someone else, not to me. None of it. But what he was telling her, and please don't miss this thought, shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord, and shall we not receive evil? What he was telling her is, if God had not been so good to us, we would not have had so much to lose. Because every good and every perfect gift cometh down from above, it cometh from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. God's not variable, good sometimes, bad other times. He's good all the time. And every good thing you've ever enjoyed, even for a moment in time, came from God. And Job was telling her, I'm grieved over the loss of our children and wealth. But if it hadn't been for the blessing of God, we would have been childless and we would have been in poverty to start with. God was awful good to us for us to prosper that much. I'm broken that it's gone, but I'm not bitter against the giver. What we oftentimes do, we think we accumulated it and God took it away. No, the Lord gave and the Lord had taken away. Don't ever forget that. Any good thing you have that you enjoy, that's a pleasure to you, you're thankful for, God gave it. And if God takes it away, you better not get bitter against God, because he's the one who allowed you to enjoy it to start with. And Job was reasoning with his wife. And so here's a good woman. It said, in all this, verse 10, in all this, Job sinned not, or did not sin with his lips. When we come to chapter 1, verse 22, after the death of his 10 children, it said, in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Charge God foolishly, speak against God, indict God, blame God, criticize God, question God. And all this, he didn't do that. And in chapter 2 and verse 10, and all this did not Job sin with his lips. Charles Spurgeon made an interesting statement. He said, if all of men's sins were bound into 2 bundles, one entire bundle, or 1/2 of all of men's sins, would be sins of the tongue. If I could learn to control my mouth, I'd cut out about half of my sin. I'm not going to live sinless, but I could do way better than I'm doing. Of course you couldn't, right? The truth is that if we could learn to control the tongue, you can't unring a bell, you can't unsay a word. On one occasion, a man had slandered another. Later, he got right with God in his heart and came to Spurgeon and said, look, I slandered this guy. How do I make it right? Spurgeon gave him a feather pillow. He said, go up to the bell tower and shake all of the feathers into the wind. Man went up, shook feathers into the wind. He came back down, and he said, now what? He said, go gather them all up. Don't miss a one. He said, that's not possible. And he said, the damage you've done with your tongue is not possible to correct. You can labor to undo it, but there's always something that was spread that you can't unspread. You can't unsay. Better learn to control your tongue. And in this case, Job was not chewing his wife out. He was just telling her, don't talk like that. You know better than that. God has been good to us, and the voice of reason prevailed. You don't find her throughout the rest of the book saying anything negative. This was it. She needed a man of God at the house. And what we have today is this feminized bunch of men. And their wife is at her wit's end emotionally, and the guy cries on her shoulder and finishes her off instead of being her rock and her strength. Instead of the voice of reason, he cries on her shoulder. I've never seen such wimpy, pathetic men. God help us. We're in trouble. But the Bible tells us what God said about Job. He said, Job is my servant. He didn't say Job is a servant. He said, Job is my servant. God was claiming exclusive rights to Job. He is my servant. He's my hands. He's my feet. He's my lips. He's my servant. He does my bidding. You know, in Matthew 6 and verse 24, the Bible said no man can serve two masters. Either he will hold to the one, despise the other. He hate the one, love the other, hold the one, despise the other. He said, ye cannot serve God and mammon. He didn't say you can't serve God and have mammon. Did Job have a lot of mammon? But God said he's my servant. You know, maybe if God could trust me with mammon, he'd give me some. But I think too often what we have becomes the object of our life rather than the giver. And the Bible tells us that God blessed Job, and Job had much mammon, but that wasn't what his life was about. He was never distracted by his wealth, his possessions, his power. It was always about God. And because of that, God could trust him and bless him. You know, in Galatians 1 verse 10, Paul said, if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. I'm supposed to be the servant of Christ. Now, if I'm the servant of Christ, God's in the people business. So if I'm the servant of Christ, I end up ministering to people. But I don't give them what they want, I give them what he wants. I serve the people, but I serve them according to the will of God, not according to their will. If you're not careful, you become the servant of people instead of the servant of God that ministers to people. We have a whole generation of young preachers today that are just submitting to the will of the people. They want rock music, give them rock music. Want black lights, give them black lights. Want strobe lights, give them strobe lights. Get dancers in the aisle. Throw all the standards out the window. Get rid of the invitation. Don't press too hard. Don't have any preach any standards. Don't get anybody under conviction. Well, that gratifies the flesh. But God wants us to be a holy people, and we better have somebody who's going to tell us what we need to hear instead of what we want to hear. A lot of times what we need to hear is not what we really wanted to hear. Wasn't good news. It didn't bring joy to our ears when we heard it, but nevertheless, it was exactly what we needed. And in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 17, the Bible tells us about the 3 Hebrew children. They said, if it be so, O King, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. And he will deliver us. But if not, you should preach a sermon, but if not, God's able to prevent me from having an evil disease. And I'm trusting him to do that. But if not, I still won't bow. I still won't change. Huh? Hey, if it draws a crowd or scatters a crowd, truth is paramount. I'm supposed to stay with the truth. It's not about the response. It's about delivering God's truth and unadulterated truth. But he tells us These three young men, our God whom we serve. You got one of those? A God that you serve. He's able to deliver us. We believe that he will. But if not, if we go in there in the burning fiery furnace, we'll die faithful and obedient before we live disobedient. We're not going to compromise, save ourselves. God can deliver us. We believe he will. But if not, we serve God. Not going to bow to images and idols. You know, find the same thing with Daniel in chapter 6 and verse 20. The heathen king who had observed Daniel's life. When the king had been manipulated by Daniel's enemies and cast him into the den of lions, when he put him in there, he said, thy God, whom thou servest continually. Wow. This is a heathen king. Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. A heathen king had that much confidence in Daniel's Christianity or in his godliness, in his walk with his God. Thy God, whom thou servest continually. I suppose serve him not intermittently, but continually. You know, the Bible tells us in Matthew 11, verse 28, we're invited into his yoke. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Take my yoke upon you. A yoke is for labor, not for playing. And folks, listen to me. I'm not against playing, but it's way overrated. People skip church so they can go play together. You've been way better off you came to church together than taking your kids to play or watch them play. Playing's way overrated. I'm not against sports. I like them. But when they conflict with me doing the will of God needs to come first. I need to be the servant of the Lord. Continually, not intermittently. I need to get in the yoke and be pulling the plow instead of walking along behind watching. I'm not a spectator, I'm a participant. Maybe the prayer that you need to pray is what Paul said in Acts 9, verse 6 on the road to Damascus. He said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? There's something for you to do. You're still breathing. You're here. You're not here to take up space. There's something for you to do, I tell you. There's something in the will of God for you to do. You can make a difference for the glory of God. There's something for you to do. I'd find out what it was and not waste another hour or another day. Figure it out, do something for God, be the servant of the Lord. Hast thou considered my servant Job? He said there's none like him in the earth. I'd say Job might have been peculiar. And the word peculiar does not mean weird. If I had to out-weird this society, I have no idea how I could do it, what I could do to my body to be weirder than what I see every day. Honestly, I'm in shock sometimes going through the airport. It's like they got to see the look on my face. It's like, it's not on purpose. It's just like, what? Did I just see that? Really? Peculiar does mean rare. A peculiar treasure is a rare treasure. If something is peculiar to a certain person, it means it is exclusively theirs, not shared. We are to be a peculiar treasure to God. We're to have a personal relationship with God. He says in this passage, and by the way, according to Titus chapter 2, the same grace that saved me apart from works teaches us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, godly in this present world. And he tells that we're to be a peculiar people. Peculiar is not weird, but it is certainly different. It is certainly rare. It is certainly something that pleases God. And God declared about Job that he is to me peculiar. He's sold out to me. He's yielded to me. You know, literally, if the word peculiar would imply that I'm swallowed up in the person of God. It has to do with the relationship. Now, when Jonah was swallowed by the whale, everywhere Jonah looked was whale. And nothing could get to Jonah except it came through the whale. You know, if I'd ever get swallowed up in God, everywhere I look, it would be God. And that's not what we see when we look around. We see sin, we see worldliness, see carnality. Our eyes are not in their head. And some of it has to do with our relationship with God or lack of it. Lack of being a separated, holy, peculiar people, consecrated to the person of God, but sanctify the Lord God in your heart and be ready always to give every man an answer for the reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. 1 Peter 3 and verse 15. So God declared Job as peculiar, not weird, not strange, but peculiar. And then he said he's perfect. You say, preacher, nobody's perfect. Now, if the word perfect meant sinless, I'd have to agree with you. The Bible word perfect has nothing to do with sinlessness. It has everything to do with me being complete, entire, everything I could be and should be, when for the time. You know, and the Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 5, he said, for when for the time